Good afternoon. I'll call the committee to order. Mr. McCallum, please. This is the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, we are studying the strengthening of the protection of women in our immigration system. This meeting is televised. We have three witnesses before us today. We have Ms. Debbie Douglas, who's the Executive Director of the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. Good afternoon to you, Ms. Douglas. We have Queenie Chu, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Success. And we have Emil Belassin, who is the representative of the Women's File. Good afternoon to you. We will let you go first, Ms. Belassin. You have up to 8 minutes to make a presentation to the committee.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, members. I'm very happy to be here today and to be able to be a witness for the first time. I will not want to lose time, so I will start directly. I come from Montreal, and I come here to speak on behalf of immigrant organization representing women, particularly for those women who are immigrant women who are radicalized in Quebec, racialized in Quebec. Today, I have 2 points to make. The first is this, dealing with the status of admission. There is a certain precariousness in terms of the lives of immigrant women. And secondly, a related point to status, I will talk about the economic precariousness of the situation in which immigrant women must live. First point, with respect to admission to the country. I will speak in terms of sponsorship. In 2012, October 2012, when the federal government announced the conditional period for residency of 2 additional years, it had an effect on sponsorship. We are in contact with immigrant families, and what I'm going to say to you today is based directly on what the women have told me themselves and on the research that has allowed me to speak on behalf of immigrant women. This is the whole truth, pure reality. We have noted that these new regulations governing immigration will mean that certain spouses will have difficulty and may well be removed if they are not living with their spouse for a certain period of time. For these women who have been racialized, there should be an unconditional permanent residency that should be included in the immigration policy of Canada. That would, with the new changes, women in particular are being exposed to a heightened risk of violence. And there are, in fact, exemptions for the abusive spouse. This affects women in this way, particularly with respect to the sponsor who brings them in and who could exercise pressure on them if the women do not comply with the regulations, which could have them removed from the country. Women in Canada and immigrant women who are underrepresented in the group, the category of women immigrating to Canada, are being prejudiced in this way. Despite the fact that there is this abusive treatment, women cannot benefit, and many of them cannot benefit from the Canadian legal structure during this 2-year conditional period. Abused spouses, particularly women, we feel will not be able to benefit from the exemption because of obstacles that are put in their path with respect to language, and because they are very often isolated from other women. You know, denouncing violence, speaking out about violence in your private life is very often something that many cultures do not speak about. And they are often living in the fear of being rejected by their family if they speak out. All you have to do is think about an arranged marriage. The prospective bride cannot speak out about violence because of the family pressure. We have borne witness to, in the past year or so, several crimes that have been directly related to this type of arranged marriage and violence. Women, immigrant women, must understand what violence is and how it should be defined, because very often they think violence is limited to physical violence, but there are different types of violence. Physical, of course, economic, and also psychological. Now, we feel that there are other ways of trying to deter fraud other than the measures that have been set out. For example, you can refer to the country of origin to see if there was indeed the marriage that took place. There are ways of checking this out. And with the guarantor, with the sponsor, you do not have to be limited to the file that is placed before your eyes. Actually, you can actually proceed to an interview or to a meeting with that person. It's just not enough to have a file to get a general idea about what is happening based only on what is contained in the file. There are many women who are not familiar with the laws. They don't know what being sponsored really means. They have to be informed about the different possibilities, the different statuses that exist, and also the various possibilities of sponsorship. In the Canadian embassies abroad, very often we organize information sessions on Canada, Quebec, and so on. So I believe that it would be worthwhile to organize an information session on immigration laws. Okay. For the second point, we have seen recently that there are new measures that deal with sponsorship in the general context. And the person who is going to be sponsored, the wife or the husband, has to understand English or French well, demonstrate a competency in that language, and be of a certain level so that that person can be sponsored. These measures in and of themselves constitute an obstacle to family reunification. You know, when you take women very often don't choose to immigrate, but if their husband, for example, has gone abroad, they follow him and they choose the new country because of their spouse. With respect to professional competencies now, very often there is not a recognition of foreign credentials.
You are next. 8 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Violence against women happens in all cultures and religions, and in all ethnic and racial communities, at every age, in every income group. Immigrant women under the spousal sponsorship program are more vulnerable to abuses or domestic violences due to the sheer nature of the power imbalance in the relationship between them and their spouse partners. This is compounded by the economic dependence, conceivable language and cultural barriers, controlling attitudes, threats by their spousal partners who keep them deliberately isolated from the outside world, and withholding their passport, for example, and immigration documents. Fear of the children's safety and welfare, as well as her uncertainty of her PR status, that will keep her continue with this abusive relationship. Furthermore, the lack of knowledge of her legal rights and community and protective support services adds to a further complication and challenge for her. Refugees who arrive in Canada traumatized by war or oppressive government are very much less likely to report physical and sexual violence to the authorities for fear of further victimization or even deportation. There are also cases that sponsored immigrant women are abused by extended family members of the sponsor partner. Breaking the cycle of domestic abuses and violences is very difficult and challenging. Helping the sponsored immigrant women to decide to walk away from their bettered relationship with all the odds against her has proven to be very challenging and complicated as well. It is important that we recognize there are systems in place. Canada has well-intended laws to protect abused women and immigration policy to guard against sponsorship frauds. However, the application of these rules has sometimes created unintended barriers for immigrant women in abusive and domestic violence relationship. For example, as soon as the sponsor partner terminates the sponsorship when the immigrant woman leaves the marriage or tries to leave an abusive relationship, she lost her legal status to stay in Canada. Settlement agencies and transitional houses providers are seeing an increasing number of mothers without legal status across the country. There are cases where sponsorship applications are incomplete or a process has not even started, and the women's status has expired. Given that the children's primary residence is in Canada, they cannot leave the country to return to their own country of origin with the children without the consent from their ex-partner. This means that they must stay in Canada without status. Our legal system, as a result, would not grant much favors to this mother without legal status application for child custody or access decisions. Taking the child out of the country or away from the abusive partner would make the mother without legal status run the risk of being accused of child abduction. Even in situation if the children can stay with her under protection order in a transition house, the father's access to the children in a neutral place, the transitional house, sometimes leads to violence. They usually have no means to get a trustworthy third person to take the children to a place to enable the father's access to the children. The YMCA has launched a national campaign requesting CIC to expedite the first stage approval of the legal status of mother without legal status or immigrant women leaving the spousal abusive relationship, who apply on humanitarian and compassionate grounds as they are living in danger. We, Success, agrees that this is one critical solution that opens the doors to improve both the short-term and long-term livelihood of these immigrant women. However, the success rates for these applications are usually low, and the whole process to receive legal status ranging from 2 to 3 years remains very long. Help is not happening soon enough for these immigrant women in crisis. We would like the parliaments to strengthen and speed up the legal status issue for these sponsored immigrant women who find themselves in abusive relationship with the spouse. On the other angle, from the perpetrator's side, we agree that the abusive spousal partner should carry their share of the responsibility and punitive consequences of their doings. The issue is that the perpetrators have to see that they are the problem, not their spousal partner. The problem stops with the abuser. It is more practical to really make the perpetrators to pay or own the government for the cost of all the supportive government and social services to help the immigrant women living in abusive sponsorship relationship and to rebuild their lives and the welfare of their children to economic independence. The government can even make this a condition in the spousal sponsorship application in the event of a spousal sponsorship breakdown in any abusive and also violence situation. It is important to look at, apart from the support services, apart from the legal protection for the abused women, safety and custody of the children, crisis intervention by transition houses, continued legal aid services and legal education, medical health, mental health services, counseling support services, affordable housing, both long-term and short-term, settlement service, access to education and language skill training, income assistance, child care services, bridging the immigrant women. There are too many to mention in here. I'm pleased to learn that currently there are tools being developed by the BC Transition House Association and the AMSA, which is umbrella organization for all settlement services, which will be distributed by the BC Government Ministry to train and assist settlement practitioners in a sector to become more sensitized to the issue and know to address and refer out to the appropriate resources. Let me conclude by citing you two real cases encountered by our agency's frontline settlement workers. Case 1. An immigrant wife from China, sponsored by her spouse, had been verbally abused since the beginning of the marriage. He set strict rules in the house, and if she didn't do things his way, he was verbally abusive to her. She thought that he was the breadwinner and worked hard outside and should be able to put up with him. Later, she got sick and found out she had cancer. After that, the situation became worse. Even after her chemotherapy, her treatment for cancer, when she was still very weak, she had to cook for him and clean the house. Her parents came to visit from China to help her. They found out their daughter was abused and called the police many times when the abuses were repeatedly increasing. But due to the language barrier, these parents of our client could not explain well to the police, and yet the husband, the abuser, who could speak English, always to tell the police, these are the family argument, no big deal. So the police left without any actions. Some of the wife's friend offered help, but the husband refused most of the time. He said taking care of her was his responsibility. If she got help from outside, that means he hadn't done a good enough job. So friends could only come to her place when the husband was working. With other people's help, her parents informed the Ministry of Children and Family Services that the spouse beat up their 3-year-old son. So the ministry sent a social worker for a home visit. But again, no further action was taken. Social workers in the hospital were aware of her situation. With their help, she was moved to a shelter for a couple of days, but was forced to leave because of the shelter could not take care of a sick person like her. Her parents tried to draw media attention for help. But the story was published by one Chinese newspaper.
Got to move on soon, Ms. Chu. I'm sorry, you're a minute over already.
Okay, so and then she passed away, and she did not get the help she needed at the age of 30.
I'm sorry. An important story, but we have to move on. Ms. Douglas, it's your turn. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, and thank you for that story, Queenie. I think it underscores how frontline workers are dealing with these issues on a daily basis. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm from the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, OCASI, and we welcome the opportunity to contribute to the study undertaken by this committee on strengthening the protection of women in our immigration system. OCASI is the umbrella organization for Ontario's immigrant and refugee serving sector with over 230 agencies across the province. A number of my member agencies provide a range of violence prevention, emergency housing for abused women, immigration support, healthcare, employment and skills training, among other services. You've heard from some of them, and you will in the next coming weeks, particularly from organizations like the South Asian Women's Center and the Afghan Women's Association. And so we are very pleased that the work that's being done in Ontario will be coming to you along with our concerns. Ocasio has appeared as a witness on numerous occasions before the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration, as well as other parliamentary and Senate committees, to share our expertise and experience on issues that impact on immigrants and refugees. We have also had the opportunity to contribute to this and other committee study of proposed and existing legislation through written submissions, and I must apologize that you do not today have my presentation in front of you. I would like to offer some thoughts in the few minutes that I have on two issues: the proposal to impose an education and skills requirement as well as language requirement for spousal sponsorship as a violence prevention measure, and two, on the 2-year conditional permanent residency that both of my colleagues have also spoken about. First, the proposed requirements. Distressingly, violence against women in Canada is a very real phenomenon. And it's a phenomenon that cuts across race, ethnicity, economic and social class, ability, and age. The one unifying truth, I think, is fair to say, is that violence against women is a function of patriarchy. The Canadian Women's Foundation reports that half of all women in Canada have experienced at least one incident of physical or sexual violence since the age of 16. 67% of Canadians say they personally know at least one woman who has been sexually or physically assaulted. Ocasio has heard from our frontline practitioners in the immigrant and refugee serving sector that in their experience, spousal violence is significantly underreported. The 2009 StatsCan study, Family Violence in Canada, a statistical profile, noted that disclosing spousal violence is difficult for many victims, and not all incidents are reported to the police. Fewer than 3 in 10 victims of spousal violence reported the abuse to the police. The study noted that other forms of spousal abuse, such as emotional, psychological, or financial abuse, are not offenses chargeable under the criminal code and therefore were not included in the analysis. As I said earlier, violence against women can occur in all communities, regardless of culture, religion, language, age, or ethnicity. It is not limited to low-income women, to unemployed women, women with limited education, or to immigrant and refugee serving women. To immigrant and refugee women. Some women are at greater risk because other factors such as a lack of knowledge of their rights or their ability to pursue them, lack of access to services or resources, or because of racial and other forms of discrimination when they try to access protection or services. The Canadian Women's Foundation further found that immigrant women were maybe more vulnerable to domestic violence due to economic dependence, language barriers, and a lack of knowledge about community resources. Newcomers who arrive in Canada, traumatized by war or oppressive governments, are much likely to report physical or sexual abuse to the authorities for fear of further victimization or even deportation. Many racialized women face barriers to reporting incidents of physical or sexual assault or seeking help. A study with young women of color in Toronto found that 1 in 5 experienced racism in the healthcare system, which included cultural insensitivity, racial slurs, and poor quality of care. And that was particularly for young women of color who had experienced sexual assault. Let me state again that in spite of these findings, women are not more prone to violence of abuse because of a lack of education or a lack of labor market access. A recent Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives report noted that 70% of Canadian women who report having experienced spousal violence are working women, and 71% have a university or college degree. We are therefore very doubtful that imposing an education and skills requirement as well as a language requirement on a sponsored spouse would do anything to address spousal violence, and instead may become another factor that can contribute to the vulnerability of the sponsored spouse. At present, The only requirement for marriage in most Canadian provinces and territories is an age limit, which is meant to ensure protection for minors. And I want to add here that we support the proposal that's on the table to increase the age of spousal sponsorship from 16 to 18. The Council absolutely welcomes that change. We do find it deeply troubling, however, that the Canadian government is now contemplating telling Canadians who they can and cannot marry by imposing language, education, and skills requirement. This is akin to the government acting as a marriage broker for Canadian spouses. What will happen in the event that a Canadian has married overseas to a spouse that does not meet these requirements? Are they to live apart? Is the Canadian sponsor expected to divorce the spouse and find one that is more palatable to meet CIC requirements? And while these might all sound very far-fetched, those are the kinds of questions that arise when we look at imposing these kinds of requirements and who can be married and sponsored into our country. Further, given that spousal violence and violence against women is an issue that impacts all Canadian women, regardless of immigration status and place of birth, we are extremely puzzled at the proposal to address this very serious issue through an immigration lens. We believe that these proposals would not address the issue and would instead punish certain Canadians and certain immigrants.
We have less than a minute, Ms. Douglas, please.
The committee is also looking at the issue of forced marriage, and I wanted to say that this is a very serious issue that with cause for grave concern, not only of this committee, but of all departments federally, particularly the status of women. You've heard from the witness from the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario who did a study on forced marriage, that their research showed that forced marriage is an issue that impacts on many Canadians and is not restricted to a particular geographic region or culture, but it is an issue that we must address as a nation. But before I conclude, there are 3 or 4 key recommendations that we want to make that we believe will address the issues that my colleagues have spoken on, especially around the 2-year sponsorship, which I don't have time to speak to, as well as general issues of violence against women.
We have a problem, Ms. Douglas. You're at 8 minutes, and you're just getting to your summaries.
1 minute.
Okay.
Thank you.
1 minute.
We need to invest in a national campaign to build awareness and education on preventing violence against women, including forced marriage. This would include investing in education for service providers, broadly defined, which include those working with immigrants and refugees, in shelters and housing, within the healthcare field, in law enforcement, in immigration, and in community and other social work. We need to invest in services for women, including specialized services for Aboriginal women, refugee and immigrant women, women with disabilities, and older women, so that we can support them in breaking out of isolation and support them in their movement to economic independence. We need a national housing strategy that would include providing affordable housing as well as emergency and transition housing for all women that need it. And lastly, we need a national childcare strategy that would free up women to enter the labor market. I look forward to our conversation.
Yes, thank you very much to the 3 of you for your presentations, and committee members will now have some questions. Mr. Meningakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for the very insightful comments this afternoon. I'm going to start by asking you a question, Ms. Chu, if I may. In your organization, do you get requests for assistance from individuals that are forced into marriage? And if you do, what steps do you tell them to take?
As an immigrant serving organization, we offer the information that is available based on the immigration directions and rules to help them, because many of those women, language isn't a barrier. So we help them to understand. We provide the tools that are available for them. However, because of this is a very challenging and complicated issue among the household. Mm-hmm. And many of them, when they return back to the home or house, it get back to their own kind of situation again. It's kind of a self-perpetuated situation.
Do you find that in those situations where they're facing forced marriage, that they are aware of their rights with respect to, moving forward, what they can do here in Canada?
I don't believe they all understand the rights and also their responsibility being in Canada. And this is what we're trying to say, is to make sure, whether through education sessions, to make sure we're able to help them understand, what are their rights, what are their responsibility in Canada.
Because one of the a previous witness to the committee, Chantal Desloges, she mentioned that she believed that the minimum wage for those being sponsored should be raised from 16 to 18. Would you agree with that?
In terms of the age, I think that, as long as we make it reasonable and we make it less a barrier to people, I think that would help the vulnerable women to get on with the being economically independent.
Ms. Douglas, welcome back. Nice to see you again. Some witnesses that have presented to our committee have discussed conditional permanent residence. We know that if women present evidence that they are in a forced or abusive marriage, the proposed condition would cease to apply in instances where there is evidence of such abuse or neglect. What evidence can be used, in your opinion?
That's the difficult things in proving violence. Outside of physical bruises, as well as if there are witnesses to the abuse. But what we have been told by our frontline practitioners who have been working with those women is that even when women somehow get that information and they attempt to get further information about the implications for their immigration status, many citizenship offices do not have that information, so they're not aware of the exemption. And so women are being given wrong and often contradictory information. Exacerbating the problems is that the 1-800 number from CIC is often not answered by a person in real time, and so folks are not able to get the information that they require so that they can be informed that yes, if you're being abused, that you really can leave, that you will be exempted from the deportation order or the conditionality of the 2 years of not living together with your spouse. So hence our push for education, not only of the sponsored spouse, but also of those working in immigration and in other service agencies, so that women are getting accurate information in terms of the implications for their immigration status.
Yeah, one would think that the first step when somebody's being abused is to call the police. I mean, the first thing that would come to mind is not, let me call CIC's 800 number when they're abused. But I understand what you're saying. I don't want to take away from what you're saying.
And as
have you come across examples of where specific evidence that they presented was rejected?
No, we haven't had any specific examples where the evidence has been rejected. But there also isn't any intentional collection of what's happening since October 2012 with the implementation of this new regulation. And so I know that in Ontario, as a council, we haven't started collecting that kind of information, and I don't believe my counterparts across the country, whether it's AMSA or La Table in Quebec, have started collecting that information either.
Well, let me ask a question of you, Ms. Belhassen, if I may. Are women generally afraid to present their evidence in cases where they've been abused? Do you think? They're very vulnerable. They're here. They don't know what perhaps a mainstream Canadian would know. In your opinion, do you think they would be? There's a tendency for them to be afraid to present their evidence when they are being abused?
Yes. In our experience, the meetings that we've had with a variety of women who have come to us for help is this. They are afraid of denouncing their spouse. They are also afraid, though, of the community, because the community frowns on this type of denunciation. There are women who have come to us with bruises and yet would not speak out. But, there's not just physical violence, there's psychological violence. And don't understand when they outline their situation and when the professional tells them, this is a case of psychological violence, they say, what's that? So earlier on in my presentation, I wanted to try to say we have to prevent this type of situation from happening. These women have to be informed about the laws here in Canada, the laws and what they are entitled to here in Canada. They've come here to Canada. As I said earlier, there should be information sessions before they come here just to explain to them the context, the background of sponsorship, the spouse, the duties and the rights.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. And first of all, I want to talk about success, the work that you do in our communities. I know you're from British Columbia and Vancouver, and you provide a wonderful service to the people in the Lower Mainland. And I know a number of organizations that you work with and individuals in my constituency. So thank you very much for being here and for serving our community. My question to you is how many languages you use? Many provide interpreters, and you will not only help people in our official languages, which are English and French, but you have other languages that you use. You have volunteers for that. How many languages do you think you provide your services?
We actually about 20 plus languages that we provide. Mm-hmm. And we also have work with the language bank to offer their services depending on the person, where they come from, and the language that they speak, in the attempt to make sure they understand, the intent and the message and the rights and responsibilities.
So what you're telling me is that the language is not an issue to provide information to people or to interact with your clients in the Lower Mainland?
Provided they know how to access the service, right. Provided they know what services are available for them.
But once they do come to success, they are able to interact in the language of their choosing?
Yes.
Okay, so here, I'm a little confused here. Somebody coming from another country to Canada would not necessarily know our laws and then our regulations mm-hmm. here. Would that be correct?
That's correct.
That would be regardless of their language, their ability to speak English or ability to speak French. Would that be correct?
Yes.
So what we're saying here, language doesn't play a role in understanding our laws and our regulations here. So would it be fair to say that we talked about providing more education, providing more resources for women that are subject to violence here. Once they do reach here, are we able to provide them with the information and help that's needed in their native language?
Well, let me put it this way. Even a layman, it's hard to interpret law, put it this way. So I just want to share with you some of the examples. I didn't have time to do it. The second example, even the person know the language is not necessarily understand the legislation and the implication of the laws. I think it's important that as a government, as a service providing agency, we have the responsibility and obligation to help those vulnerable people not only understand the language, but also understand the implication and also the responsibility and their rights. Mm-hmm.
So language is not the primary reason that they don't know the laws and what rights they have in this country.
Yeah, I think we are kind of splitting hairs. If they don't have the basic language skill, they would not be able to understand even a day-to-day kind of talking. Some of them come in with very much minimal or even in the pre-literacy stage in the country of origin. So that means they're illiterate in the country of origin. Mm-hmm. So let alone English language. Even though we talk to them in their own native language, we have to make sure that we speak at the level that they can understand, let alone the law and the regulation in Canada.
Ms. Bellhesson, you talked about arranged marriages and then I think you may be confusing arranged marriage and forced marriages. You talked about violence committed against people that are in arranged marriages. Did you mean that forced marriages, maybe? And can you clarify what your understanding is between arranged marriages and forced marriages?
Okay. Arranged marriages generally are agreed between the two members of the couple, the partners. And sometimes it's the family that intervenes to arrange the marriage. With respect to a forced marriage, I would imagine that the woman, the spouse, was forced to choose this type of marriage. She wouldn't have, that wouldn't have been her choice, but she was forced to choose that. There is a certain type of violence that exists in both cases, but as I have said, in this particular case, you have to try to prevent and avoid any type of a situation that or event that would trigger this violence. I'm the one who will be continuing the questioning. I'd like to come back to something that Ms. Belason said, and then I'll make an observation. You have spoken about the importance before the sponsored person arrives in Canada, how important it is that they have access to information, that information is given them to inform them of their rights, to help them if they need help of any type, and to help them sign the documents, for example, for sponsorship in the language of origin. Would you all agree with the need for this type of information before they arrive here?
The sector actually across the country have identified the need, and we do have some services paid for through Citizenship and Immigration Canada of pre-arrival services, and having a discussion and having modules that include violence against women, that includes information on conditional sponsorship and the exemptions, that includes discussions on Canadian law, especially as it has to do with gender equality and other issues of concern to women in particular, we think is critically important. We have the mechanism to do it. We are looking as a sector, including Citizenship and Immigration Canada, in expanding pre-arrival services. I think the research is bearing out that folks who are well informed before they come here have an easier time in terms of the settlement process, and so violence against women issues as well as other issues as it has to do with women's rights and responsibilities is critical in terms of being included in any pre-arrival services that we're providing.
Thank you. Mr. McCallum.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair.
I would
We can go, but she's using your time if you wish.
Well, then she can go some other time, because I don't have much time. Thank you very much to all of you for being here and for all the work you do. I'd like to start about the question of language tests for spouses. More than 30 years ago, I married a woman from Malaysia, and I would have been shocked if the government of the day had said that in order for this woman to be my wife, she had to pass a language test or an education test or any other kind of test other than age and non-criminality. It would have struck me as Orwellian, 1984-ish, and definitely not the role of a government. So I think Ms. Douglas was very clear on this point. I just want to ask the other two witnesses, without going into great length, whether you agree or disagree with the language tests on spouses.
I would concur Douglas' point in terms of the language requirement.
Thank you. Et vous?
Oui, moi aussi, je suis d'accord. I too agree. I do agree that they have to know more or less well one of the or the other of the official languages. So you're saying that you don't agree. You're talking about a language test. But I don't want this to be a condition for sponsorship, because according to the provisions, the measures, it's conditional. They have to be able to speak one or the other of the official language as well, or demonstrate competency. But it shouldn't become Conditional. Well, are you saying it should be a condition or not?
Agree that language test should not be a condition, right? Okay. Second question, the question of this 2-year conditional living together rule. And Madame Bellassin was very clear that she was opposed to that because she didn't think it helped the violence problems and so on. I'd just like to ask the other two whether you are for or against this conditional 2-year living together rule.
I appeared before this committee. I found opportunities when appearing before this committee to raise the whole issue of that regulation. And we are on the public record of being against the fact of having 2-year conditionality imposed on sponsorship. I didn't get to it in my remarks. We believe that.
Okay, sorry, I don't have much time, and I have another issue. Ms. Chu?
I think my example actually illustrates the fact that it might not be helpful in those abusive situations under those conditions.
Thank you. So we have unanimity on those 2 points. I have a third, more positive point, which I really like the idea because I think it is practically reasonable to speed up the legal process for abused mothers so that they can stay here longer, so that they're able to stay here without huge delays. And one of you proposed that, and I'd like to ask in my final question whether the other two would also agree that that is a good practical proposal. It struck me very positively.
Yes. It makes sense to have women stay here in Canada with their children, as opposed to having the children separated from their mothers because their fathers happen to be Canadian, as was presented here.
Yes, I support this. I think it's very important for them to stay here with their children.
Unanimity on the 3 points.
Mr. Leong, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for witness for being here. Ms. Chu, I am very curious about your example, the first example, the case study you gave, but I also will allow you perhaps 2 minutes to share with us your second example, and then the remainder of the time I'll the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Long. This is a second example. Is an Arabic-speaking client that was sponsored by her husband. When she came, she was psychologically abused by her husband for the fact that her husband lied to her about the living condition in Canada. Instead of told her wife, his wife, that he was living in a very nice condition, he did not. He was living in a very small apartment, but also had a seasonal labor job. So to the contrary. So and also the fact that she also was not able to go outside to work under his scrutiny, as well as she was not permitted to communicate and with others and make friends. And so she was very much socially isolated and very much under that psychological abusive situation. So the marriage didn't turn out right. And she certainly wanted to go back to her own country of origin. However, he will threaten her and say, well, if you go back, the sponsorship will be terminated. So she was under a lot of psychological threat and a material threat as well, until she became ill, okay? And she was deprived for medical treatment because the husband refused to pay for the costs. Then, with all this, I'll just summarize that in fact, she decides to leave him because she also understood, because she's well educated, so she was able to speak the language. However, she still needs help in terms of getting her rights identified and known. So she did leave the husband. She did leave the marriage that she came in to Canada for.
Okay, well, then I gather from your previous, all three of your testimony, you indicated that it is important to provide information to prospective spouses either before they enter the country to know what our laws are and where they can get help. But at the same time, I also see the point that government should not dictate whether a language should be a requirement for a person to get married. So given that information, how can we deliver the information to these prospective spouses, whether they're illiterate in their own language or whether they lack English or French, the information of how to get help and what their rights are? I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
Actually, in fact, this example speaks to the importance of pre-arrival, that they need to understand what is the Canadian system in terms of the relationship. In those abusive situations, what they can do, how they can get help, what is the legal assistance that they would be able to access for. That's even speak to the need of those individuals before they come. Not only the women, but also equally important, before this arrangement, the husband also need to get the same information so that they agree upon those situation and agreement before they have, got their spousal approval. So I think it is very important in terms of the pre-arrival information. Many of them, if they have the basic language skill, would be better off. However, there are many of them don't even have that. And that is so important to identify when you see the two case scenarios.
Ms. Douglas, would you care to comment on that, please?
I think it speaks to the need for information about the existence of services. I think that here in Canada, we probably have one of the most sophisticated settlement and integration service sector. Globally, we certainly know that because we have lots of visitors from across the world coming in to take a look at our system. And yet there are many, many newcomers who don't know about it. One of our own research in Making Ontario Home talked about, for those not using services, upwards of 30% didn't use it because they weren't aware of it. So pre-arrival information before they come, on-arrival information in terms of letting folks know what services exist, where they are in their community, and the kinds of supports that they can get when they need it.
In the pre-arrival situation, that means that we have to deliver that message in almost 190 languages. I mean, there's a potential that we may have to do that for every major language group that exists around the world.
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head how many countries right now where we do have some pre-arrival services. I know out of the UK office, they probably take care of about 20 countries. Asia is pretty well covered, China, the Philippines, in India in particular. The UK tends to take care of the continent of Africa and the Middle East. And so we are building infrastructure in terms of being able to deliver those services overseas. It's really looking at where it is that we're putting investments. And I want to say again, it has to be seamless, right? It has to be pre-arrival and in Canada information once they arrive here.
Madam Hudson, would you wish to comment on that, on the delivery of information, how we manage that with the people who may be illiterate and people who don't speak English or French as their first language?
Oui, c'est vrai.
Yes, it is complicated. That's quite true. As you have just said, because immigrant women are not questioned. We have city dwellers, we have women who are from rural areas. It's quite a variety. And there are many who have never gone to school. They don't know how to read or how to write. It's difficult, therefore, to transmit the information to them. I think it should be better targeted according to the level of understanding of those persons. It's true. There are premises there where people could transmit the information in the language of origin.
Lamothe. I'm sorry, sir.
Merci.
Time's expired.
Alors, Madame Bellassin, j'aimerais continuer la discussion de ce que vous...
Ms. Balasan, I'd just like to continue the conversation just to be sure that I understand correctly. You tell me if I've understood. You're saying that you have to, you should select the people according to their ability to adapt to the language, but there should be something there that would allow them to better adapt. So rather than putting barriers in their way, no, for the second, they have to adapt everything according to the groups that I have described. Yes. I'd like to come back now to what you have said about the difficulty of having access to services. All three of you have dealt with this issue. My colleague earlier said sometimes that the first reflex of a woman is to call the police. Well, that's not really true. Depending on the situation or the country they come from, they may or may not be comfortable calling the police. That might not be their first reflex. But I see here the CIC image and a document that says that there is an exemption for permanent residents in the case of abuse. You can call the CIC 1-800 number. But one of the witnesses has said to us that this call center is not well adapted. You might have a long wait time. Or sometimes they say they will call the woman back, but if you're right in the midst of an abusive situation, it's pretty hard to leave your telephone number and wait for a phone call back. What type of service do you think should be there to facilitate, to help these women that want to speak out about abusive situations? My question is for all three of you. May I start? As you've just said, the tools are there. The police, the departmental services, that does exist, but it is the relationship of the immigrant to the police, to the other institutions that has to be understood. I deal with immigrant women, and I often speak to them about the agencies that are here to explain to them what the police does here in Canada to demythify and to build a healthy relationship with that agency and to get rid of their baggage from their country. A great deal of work can be done here to heighten the awareness of these immigrant women.
From the service provider agency point of view, I think it now is even more significant and vital to provide this vulnerable immigrant women with the information they need should those circumstances arise, so that they know who to talk to when there's an issue, so that they are not left in those desperate situations when the crisis comes. This is important to better prepare them for the future. To the service provider agency, we got to get those services available for these people. We got to invest in those services. So this is not going to be a vicious circle for those battered women.
Mm-hmm. And let me echo Ms. Jo's comments in terms of the need to continue to invest in the settlement services and the kind of education and training that needs to happen there, so that frontline practitioners are asking the right questions, so that women are able to disclose. I believe Ms. Belhassan talked about the need to develop trust in the relationship before someone will disclose that there's violence in the relationship, particularly women who've experienced trauma coming out of refugee situations where the state has often been the oppressor. It's very difficult then to expect them to trust state institutions like the police, for example, even like settlement services, because for them walking into a service agency is basically a government agency. There isn't that sense that this is non-profit and arm's length from government. And so I believe that there is awareness that needs to be built both on the side of the immigrant woman who is coming into Canada, but also on the service industry side, whether or not it's the frontline settlement organizations, the police services, as I said, immigration officers, including folks working in our call centers.
Thank you.
On behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank the three of you for coming and sharing your knowledge and experience with us. It's been very helpful with us to prepare a report for the House of Commons. Thank you very much for coming, and we will suspend for a few moments. Ladies and gentlemen, we start with two witnesses. First witness, who is a lawyer from Montreal, apparently has transportation problems. If she arrives, we will let her participate. But in the meantime, we will start with two witnesses. We have Simon Ashman. Assen? Yes. There you go. From the Girls Action Foundation. Welcome. She is here in Ottawa with us. And we have Marie-Josée Duplessis, Executive Assistant, who is from Montreal. Can you hear me?
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Oui, très bien. Bonjour.
Excellent.
Yes, I hear you very well.
Ooh. Madame Duplessis, you have up to 8 minutes to make a presentation to the committee. Vous avez 8 minutes.
You have 8 minutes to make your presentation. Thank you very much, Chairman. Good afternoon, Chairman. Members of the committee, I would like to thank you, first of all, for inviting me. Madame Aura Berzari, our director, has asked me to speak on her behalf about our organization. The collective was founded in 1983 by stakeholders from various backgrounds. The mission is to support immigrant women and from different cultural communities and help them integrate themselves into Quebec society. To give you an idea about the work that the collective does, last year the collective set up 2 separate institutes to help women. And there are some thousands of women who have benefited of them. A total of 12,000 visits were made. 685 women benefit from the services and activities. The collective has an expertise in 2 areas covered by your study, namely the integration of immigrants into the labor market and the social isolation of immigrant women. I will start by saying a few words about immigrant women and the challenges they face. Their challenges are common to many immigrants. That means a lack of knowledge about the labor market, organizational, cultural, and other skills required for the workplace, the need to learn English or French or both, and the need to rebuild their work network. These are challenges that face all new arrivals, men and women alike. But women often have to reconcile a job or a job search with family life. Most immigrant women come from traditional societies in which each gender assumes a specific role. It's much more marked than what exists in Canada. Women are usually responsible for domestic work and taking care of children. However, they can count on a large support network and often have domestic help, even if they are not rich. Therefore, to have the time to enter the labor market here in Canada, they have to rebuild their personal support network in this new country. Women often find themselves doing their work, their domestic work alone. And so for the first time, they have to alone plan meals, prepare meals, and care for children. It's a lot at the same time. Some men do not want to share these tasks, while others are ready to help but do not know how. Regardless, these problems have an impact on the family dynamic and balance and affects the spouse's relationship. I'd just like to spend a little time on the obstacles that immigrant women face, barriers that they face unrelated to their integration and adaptation efforts. These obstacles lie in Canadian society. The first is the lack of room in subsidized daycare programs, which prevents them from trying to enter the labor market. And the longer immigrants take to enter the labor market, of course, the more difficult it is to have their credentials recognized. The second is the services need to be tailored. The immigration process and the individual situation must be taken into account, as both affect access to services and success. bewildered by the immigration process and finding themselves in a place where the rules of the game are very different, new and often implied, where both work and personal networks are non-existent, immigrant women need different support so they can regain their independence. And goodness knows that independence is a quality, a characteristic that is prized in our society. Program standards for political labor market integration, and here I'm talking more specifically about Emploi Québec in terms of Quebec. These services focus on reducing the number of people who are on employment assistance. Yet sponsored women are not entitled to employment assistance. Neither are economic class immigrant women during their first 3 months in Canada. Often they are not receiving a check. They're not allowed to participate in a job placement or training program because helping them does not reduce the number of employment assistance beneficiaries. This affects or delays their entry on the labor market. Of course, there's also Canadian experience. You know that is very often well known. There is very little, sometimes their skills may not be what is sought by employers. Other obstacles include competencies and skills. It's very complex, of course. It goes without saying that the biggest problem can be complex. From time to time, you have to take into consideration that they are unaware of what goes on. There have to be distribution of invitations for a free lunch on the street, at bus stops, at Metro X. We try to integrate and inform these women to bring them into the society. But even though our projects do attain good results, it is difficult to obtain further funding. And very often we have to adapt our services to the standards that have been set for the program. And in 2011, Deloitte had some roundtables that were in a variety of employers throughout Canada. It was a dialogue on diversity for some 100 different employers. Employers are risk-averse, and hiring immigrants is a risk because the recognition process is difficult. Foreign credentials are not recognized, and so instead of taking a risk, they do nothing. There is also a difficulty with respect to cultural grounds. You have 1 minute left, madam. 1 minute. Okay. What I want to do is to point out that there has to be support to assess skills and competencies, and also to promote a better understanding and a better integration of women into the labor market. There are many points that I don't have the time to discuss with you, but I would ask the committee not to hesitate to ask me any type of question during question period.
And we now have our third speaker. Welcome, Ms. Molina, who is from Montreal. We'll let you catch your breath, and we'll have Ms. Hassan speak. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Bonjour et merci de m'avoir invité à présenter.
Thank you very much for inviting me here this afternoon. I have a lot of experience working with immigrant women in Canada.
Including those in sponsorship program, face various challenges and experience considerable tensions in their efforts to bridge multiple cultures, live in a new context, and respond to the discrimination and barriers to opportunity that they face. At the same time, they also demonstrate high aspirations, skills in cultural negotiation, as well as great potential for leadership. According to statistics from a few years back, girls and young women made up to 38%, young women under 25 made up to 38% of female immigrants to Canada within that particular year. And we can see that girls and young women are at the crux of race, class, age, and gender, which are converging factors that make them particularly vulnerable. They find themselves caught between two cultures where their own is often devalued, and they face tremendous struggle in trying to fit into a new culture. Their specific needs and experiences need to be acknowledged and addressed if we want to prevent violence against them and also to prevent an abuse of the system of immigration. Immigrant and refugee processes place many women, including those who come here as spousal sponsors or those who sponsor spouses to come here to Canada. In both situations, the girls or young women in that situation are in particularly vulnerable conditions and need our support. Some immigrant girls and women face violence in their homes, but may have little or no protection due to a range of factors. I think the factors were covered by some of the participants who spoke just before me, so I won't go into detail. For example, lack of information, distrust of the police and services, fear of deportation, language barriers, fear of isolation. These are just to name a few. There's a range of factors that make them more vulnerable. And perpetrators of violence also think that they can escape punishment if the victims feel that they cannot afford to report the violence. And usually the victims are girls and women. Just to tell you a little bit about Girls Action Foundation and our approach, we're a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting girls and young women to reach their full potential as future leaders and change makers. We operate on a national scale through a network of more than 340 member groups in all provinces and territories across Canada, and we provide our members with tools, resources, trainings to help them start up programs for girls, including programs for girls from specific backgrounds such as immigrant and newcomer girls. We've supported more than 100 initiatives across Canada to build a national movement of active and engaged young women and organizations. We take an assets-based approach in working with girls and women because we see immigrant girls and women as having many strengths and skills. They work hard, they carry heavier burdens than their Canadian counterparts, and they act as cultural ambassadors and bridges between two cultures. Often they're the ones who are supporting their family, understanding and accessing services. And in this process, they develop skills such as cultural awareness, communication skills, resourcefulness, which can be valuable assets for the whole community. Immigrant girls and young women are more likely to continue and complete their education than their Canadian counterparts. So we really need to see them, girls and young women coming into Canada, including those who come in as sponsored spouses, as assets, as agents of change, not as victims or beneficiaries just waiting for our intervention. So we've worked a lot with immigrant girls and young women, and we've seen some promising practices that have been proven to work. They include building skills and self-esteem, reducing isolation and increasing connections to their communities, providing support, especially supports from their peers, and providing girls and women with girl-only spaces where they can express themselves more freely. And lastly, providing role models, including role models from their own families and communities, to show them that they can also reach levels of leadership in Canada. We have some recommendations that would reduce violence and abuse, as well as support communities, girls and women in dealing with violence. First of all, it's important to see that a holistic approach is needed, one that recognizes the diversity of needs, provides a range of social services, and builds linkages between the different services. There should be services at all levels. At the individual level, services should help young women develop skills and knowledge to participate actively in society and to deal with issues such as violence when they face them. There should be family-oriented support to address the stress that families face, especially families that are immigrating together or have other changes in their economic status due to their immigration, to help them support one another and respond together. And lastly, services to help the host communities in the process of the adaptation of newcomers, especially women who come in as sponsored spouses and are particularly vulnerable. These services should include cultural sensitivity and training for service providers who should also belong to diverse backgrounds that can relate to the young women. Increased collaboration between community centers, shelters, police and justice officials, and ongoing provision of information to immigrant women, especially sponsored spouses, about their legal rights and services. Health, well-being, and skill-building programs with a feminist and cross-cultural approach need to take place. And we should start young, because our society needs to equip girls and boys to develop into healthy, active men and women who don't commit acts of violence or abuse, but know how to respond if they're ever faced with it. Lastly, policies and programs at the government level must be proactive, and immigrant women should be engaged as a priority right from the start, not as an afterthought. They should be collaborative and flexible and adapt to differing needs and realities of the women. They need to recognize the role of immigrant women in their families, communities, and society at large. If women are provided support and resources to develop their leadership skills, they can become an immense asset, not only for the young girls of their communities, but for society at large, as they can act as role models for younger women and also provide them with support. And lastly, I just want to highlight again that we should not overlook the specific realities and challenges that girls or younger women face. And as I said, they are at the crux of race, class, age, gender, and they're particularly vulnerable, so they need specific attention to reduce their vulnerability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Hassan. And Ms. Molina, thank you for being determined to come to Ottawa.
Oh, yes, thank you for having me.
And we look forward to your presentation. You have up to 8 minutes to make a presentation to us.
Parfait.
Perfect. Thank you. Today, I will only be dealing with two subjects. With respect to the sponsorship program, the conditional residency, the 2-year conditional residency, and also the proposal that deals with the sponsored women speaking one of the 2 official languages well. I can say that the government's goal and its intention to protect women against barbarous crimes certainly is something that is praiseworthy, but by imposing such an exigency on women, it in no way attacks the source of the problem. This requirement will have disgraceful consequences and discriminatory consequences for women in certain countries. It will separate families. It will prevent women of childbearing age from beginning a family. And I would point out that this new requirement will violate the convention that deals with all forms of discrimination against women under the aegis of the United Nations. Why do I say it? It is because there are women who come from the Maghreb in North African countries where there are honor crimes and forced marriages that will not be affected by this new provision. The fact of speaking French or English will not put the woman, it will not shelter the woman from domestic violence. I have given, as a lawyer, many programs to women who have been the subject of domestic violence. Many come from African countries, from France and elsewhere. They are educated women, but they had problems. They were isolated. They had difficulty finding help and helping themselves. So it's a complex, violence is a complex problem, and it in no way will be solved by this measure. You have to note also that it is undeniable that Latin, Asian, European, and women who do not speak the language and who do not come from a country where there is forced marriage or honor crimes will be eliminated unless they learn to speak one of the official languages well. In addition, you have to understand that some women will be under enormous pressure from their spouse to learn a language quickly. If the goal is to combat barbarous practices, why is that not targeted outright? Shouldn't the government directly deal with the source of the problem? That is to say that women who are victims of honor crimes are more at risk. Family violence, Domestic violence is something that the government should directly affect a solution for. And the statement that was made in 1993 about the elimination of violence against women should be maintained. But this provision, certainly in terms of the sponsorship program, that will change little. To have them complain to the police will very often endanger them to a greater extent in the situation in which they find themselves in their home. So this brings me to my second point. The two-year conditional residency will make women more vulnerable because very often proof, evidence to the fact that they have been a victim of violence is required. That in itself can aggravate the whole situation of domestic violence. So what I'm submitting is this, is that the exception that is found, this exemption that is found in the Act should be interpreted in a very broad fashion. It should also include psychological and verbal abuse, as was outlined in the 1993 Declaration. The National Assembly defined violence against women as being any violent act which is directed against the feminine sex, causing difficulty, prejudice, or physical, sexual, or psychological suffering in women. It should be understood in this way. Now, a woman should not have to tolerate this type of situation, being shouted at, insulted, and so on, just to stay in Canada. This is a problem that existed before the two-year exemption was installed, because very often a woman involved in the sponsorship process could become a victim of domestic violence. Those women, and I've had clients in that situation, had to prove that they had complained to the police, they'd called the police, that they had physical marks on their body, bruises. It's very complicated and very traumatizing for the women involved. Realistically speaking, you have to understand that when the police intervenes, the level of violence can be heightened. I can tell you about the case of a violent husband, further to a complaint that was made to the police in Quebec. Prosecuted these women, tried to find his wife in a shelter and get her back. Very often, the institution of marriage is not protected in the way that we would like it to be seen done by judges. And sometimes it happens that the acts of violence are pardoned by the woman, and they would hope that these acts of violence are not something that reoccurs in the future. To conclude, I would give you an example of something that I had in my practice. I saw in my office a young couple with a newborn. The mother was suffering from postpartum depression, and the young husband called immigration, and what happened was that her sponsorship was set back. There was a reset, and it started once she was cured. It ended well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for your presentations today. Ma première question est pour Madame Duplessis.
My first question is for Madame Duplessis. I read your article, Le regard de Rossini sur l'immigration, Rossini's look at immigration, in which you say that immigration is a multidimensional, complicated process, linguistic, it's bidirectional, because the immigrant and his or her family is engaged in the canvas of Canadian society. That process means that the immigrant has to adopt the rhythm of each person involved in the new environment.
Avec les femmes qui sont parrainées.
How can you explain this to us? How you see this a new development for sponsored people? Thank you for your question. I did say at the outset of my testimony that I am representing the collectif, my employer in Quebec. Yes, you are right. The text that you cited is one that I wrote, but with respect to sponsored women, those sponsored women in our organization, we see them far less often because they have a network that's already there to take them under their wing. If you think in terms of labor market integration, very often the advice that is given them is not well-founded. It might be, forget your past career, you've got to start at the bottom of the ladder. You can go and try to get some type of social welfare, and sooner or later you'll find a job. They may have an academic background, they have professional experience, and if that is the case, they can be directed towards a type of work that is more fulfilling and remunerative for them. So very often people who are in that situation don't come to the collectives networks that are there. They have better prospects for the future. In the text that you read, I was speaking about a bidirectional process between the new society and the immigrants that are becoming integrated into that society. Very often, their point of attachment is the community. And the passage, the passageway, if you like, from the past to the new community, and it's the community services that plays the role of that passageway is very important. Does that answer your question? Yes, indeed. Can you share with us how you see the settlement services and how they should deal with these women? Well, of course, yes, of course. I think I mentioned that. They should take into consideration the migratory process, that is, all of the experience that they have, and the fact that many of these women, for the first time, find themselves responsible for doing everything in the family in terms of the domestic life, taking care of the kids, doing the cooking, the cleaning, and so on. And this all has an effect on the family dynamic that is shaken by their ability or not to do this. We take the feminist approach, which empowerment and the independence, the autonomy of the individual. I'm not saying that that's not a good approach, but we have to know that for immigrant women, their role, their pivotal role, is one of center of the family and also pillar of the community. That doesn't always jibe well with being an individual. So the community and the family is very important for them. For that's what we do for new immigrants to Quebec. We try to look at where the person is, and we try to see as they evolve where they're going. There are many changes, of course, that occur, but in our society of the new host country, we try to see where the person is, where they are going, and we try to build slowly a future for them in terms of the table of reference that each woman has, and which is different from what is in Canada and which is different from other women. And little by little, they are able to adjust. Sometimes there is mediation that has to be effected to see what might be a possible compromise, what could be done in terms of change, what could be done to work on the integration, all these levels. Thank you.
Ask you, Ms. Ahsan. Proxy marriages are legal right now. It's true that a couple that is married over the phone or even by fax can be eligible for the spousal sponsorship program. I'm under the impression that this could or would lead to more forced marriages. In any event, do you think that this practice needs to be stopped, and should proxy marriages be banned from the spousal sponsorship program?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
I'm not equipped in the legal background. I'm not a lawyer. I'm working for an NGO that supports girls and young women's empowerment. But I can see that there could be problems with proxy marriages. I've seen that there are cases which are totally valid, but again, there is a possibility of abuse of the system. So I don't know if it should be banned, but I think there should be some protective measures to make sure that, if there's a marriage, it's really a true valid case and not made up just for immigration purposes.
That's an excellent answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Ms. Blanchette-Lamothe.
Merci. D'abord, une question.
I have a question first for Madame Duplessis, followed by Madame Hassan. You have shown us how important first-line services are in terms of protecting sponsored women. We know that there are a lot of women who will not turn to these organizations, though, particularly the most vulnerable who don't know how to cope on the outside and reach services. What do you do to direct these most vulnerable women towards the services they need? What can the government do to help these women, to ensure that these women can contact the first line of help?
When a new immigrant comes into Canada, I am an immigrant. When I came in, I got a lot of support in finding a job. Emploi Québec helped me even before I came in. I was part of teleconferences, looking at my background, my qualifications, how I could use them when I came. So similarly, I think when a new immigrant is coming in as a spouse, before and after he or she comes here, there should be that kind of services, that outreach to her, and she has to take part in those services and sessions where she can learn about her rights, the legal situation in Canada in a very simple way. The government can make some simple worksheets, handbooks, which would help them understand the laws as they would apply to you. What to do if you're abused? What are your rights if you're abused? Would you be sent back to your country if you report abuse? So questions like that, and they should be given to the young women when they come into Canada. And then there should be a continuation process where social services providers stay in touch with them and build a relationship with them, and also help them get skills that allow them to express themselves, to learn the language, to find local supports, because usually women like to find support in their community, but they need to be really helped so they can find those supports and reach out to them and know where they can go to if they need support.
Madame Duplessis, avez-vous quelque chose à ajouter?
Something to add, Madame Duplessis? Is it my turn? Okay, thanks. Yes, well, the problem is reaching them. It's the principal goal is to reach these women. What we do a lot is we distribute information on our services in the metro, at bus stops, and we also work through major community service offices. I'm interrupting you. I want my question to be clear. I want to know if you see a role for the government in connecting vulnerable women to the services they need. Is there something the government could do to make life easier for you in terms of contacting these women, but from the angle of the government? Okay, yes, thank you for pointing that out. If you think that when these women arrive in the country, if they were given a list of all the resources that would be available to them in terms of work and associations that could help them, all of these domestic workers, and that would be an improvement. And also, there are sessions that are given. It is the Ministry of Cultural Integration and Communities that does it. to integrate these women. We look at some of the problems. We try to envisage some of the problems that they would have. One is the self-sign-up. If somebody arrives at the airport, goes through immigration, there's a service here, and you can go on the website and sign up. In the past, though, it was the immigration officer that signed up the person. The person was said, look, next Monday you go to such and such an agency for an information session on this. And next week I will write to you about the integration program that we have. So the person was already put into the network. And then there was a network that was developed amongst new arrivals by themselves. But if they can be signed up, if they can be registered for all these resources from the outset, it would be a great help. There's so many new things that come up. People say, we forgot to sign up, we didn't register, or... Thank you very much. That's very interesting. Madame Molina, I have a few questions for you. You talked about language and education. Earlier, a witness said that language and education shouldn't be a barrier, but rather should help the government to adapt to ensure that the adequate information is available to the new arrival in terms of languages, in terms of individual meetings. Would you be in agreement with this? Yes, perfect agreement. I think it's a good idea. Okay. In terms of the time that it takes to process all of these sponsorship files, we have heard that this might be a factor for the situation that vulnerable women find themselves in. Sometimes they are 3 or 4 years later joining their spouse here in Canada after their waiting period in their country of origin, and that can make them vulnerable, that waiting period in their country. Yes, of course, it depends on the origin of the woman. It might be a problem or not. But fundamentally, in terms of a woman's right to have a family, which is protected under international law, this is something that is sacred, that is basic. Women are having children later and later in life, in the 30s, in the 40s, after they finished their education. And when they do get married, they want to have their family in a hurry. This whole immigration process constitutes a barrier. I have clients who come to my office. They're very, very much in a hurry. When will I have my sponsorship? When will I have my health care coverage? I want to plan my life. I want to have a child as soon as possible. All of this is quite conditional, and it is quite distressing to these people. This is something that should be looked at by the government, I believe.
Thank you. Merci d'être ici.
Thank you for being here. I'll start with a question that deals on the assistance that the government should offer in terms of language tests for spouses. Madame Molina has mentioned that. I will put the question to all three of you. Are you or not in favor of a language test for spouses? I'm against it. I'll tell you right off, because I don't believe it's the role of the government to say to a Canadian who you should marry, to that Canadian who you should marry.
I would be against such a test.
Well, that's a very good answer. Thank you. Madame Duplessis?
Yes, I'm against it too. But it is very important to know that there are services to teach the French language as soon as they arrive, but not to select them. Oh, yes, I agree. It's important to know 2 languages, but I do not believe it should be a condition for entry.
About this new system since, I think, November 2012, where one has to live together, one is forced to live together for 2 years, to become a spouse allowed into the country. And we had some discussion in the last session, and one person at least argued that this did not do anything at all to reduce the risk of violence and was not a good idea. So I'd like to again ask each of the three of you, is this new system where the couple is forced to live together for 2 years as a condition of entry, is that a good thing? Is it helpful to the cause of against violence against women, or is it not a good thing?
Really bad thing. I think it puts spouses in it's unequal basis, and I think it's very unhealthy in a relationship. And for 2 years, it's very arbitrary that in 2 years, for sure we'll know that this is not a bad faith marriage or relationship. Often in real life, couples will fight at the beginning of a relationship, especially after when they have children, and especially for someone who comes into a new country, has to adapt. So I think it's unrealistic and not connected with reality.
Well, thank you. I don't want to rush you. I just want to make sure the other two get to answer.
I agree with that, and just to add that it would not prevent violence happening, such a condition.
Hey, Madame Duplessis?
On the contrary, I think that in a situation where there is abuse or violence, the fact of having this 2-year conditional period will mean that there will be women who might have stuck in an insupportable situation, who might have stayed in that situation. They may well leave. I think that this might help women, and in fact, without the condition, they might be at greater risk. Would you also agree, all three of you, that you are not in favor of such a rule? Exact. I'm not in favor of such a rule.
Unanimity on both of those points, so our report can be considered written. But in my remaining time, I'd just like to ask about another more positive suggestion that was made, and I thought it was a really good idea, that a lot of the problem with abused mothers is that if they get out of the relationship, they could be deported unless they appeal to stay, and that appeal process could take 1 year, 2 years, even more, and they're in the meantime in a very precarious position. So would it not be a practical solution to this kind of issue to really speed up this process so that the women involved would have a decision much faster as to whether or not they could stay in this country with their children?
Definitely, I would agree to that.
Good. I don't want to show a bias in what answers I favor, but that's a good answer.
I think that Section 4 F of the Declaration for the Elimination of Violence Against Women shed some light into the question you just asked. And I think it says, and this is what's happening here, is the government need to be careful when they pass laws that they don't increase the violence toward women when the objective is to reduce it. And I think this is what's
sometimes
we're creating
called the law
here.
of unintended consequences.
Unintended consequences.
Time's expired, Mr. McCallum. Thank you. Mr. Opitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. Thank you, witnesses, all, for being here. They were very, very good presentations, and just to start my bit, it reminds me of something that the Blessed John Paul once said, and it's the duty of every man to uphold the duty of every woman. And that's something I think we can all take away. I'll start with you, Ms. Hassan, if you don't mind. I know this was asked on the last panel, but I'd like your opinion on it. On March 4th, Chantal Deloge mentioned that she believed that the minimum age of those being sponsored should be raised from 16 to 18. Would you agree with that?
I would strongly agree to that.
Yeah. Can you elaborate?
I think that 16 is too young an age to get married in any case, and it's a young age for sponsorship. So
Okay.
I think universally across the world, 16 should be too young to get married.
Yeah, and I liked your presentation, by the way. I think you show some good leadership and developing young people and girls and giving them opportunities, and it's something
Thank you very much.
that I enjoy doing with kids in my riding, and you know, being a former trainer in the military, it's kind of part and parcel what I have done in the past. How many immigrant communities do you work with?
We don't have a number, but I said that we have a network of about 340 member groups that work across Canada. About 2/3 of them are working with immigrant or racialized communities.
Okay, great. Now, what kind of cases of forced marriages have you seen?
We haven't really seen any cases of forced marriages from my work with Girls Action Foundation. We do see girls who mention in the programs that their parents would be the ones who would find a spouse for them from their country of origin. So we do have such things, but there hasn't been any case that I have seen directly. And in such cases, when we hear girls, our job is really to build their critical thinking and their communication skills so they can, express themselves and speak to their parents, link them up with supports that are available in their community, services, community members, role models to whom they can go to when they face such situations. But we're not in the sense of being a social worker that actually intervenes in those cases.
Okay.
We're more on the prevention side.
But some of these arranged marriages, you wouldn't consider any of those forced?
I think there's a continuing.
I know there's different. That's why I'm asking you. Cause, can you define that, the difference for me?
Forced would be against a person's will.
Right.
Often, girls growing up in immigrant families they grow up with that idea that their families will choose a spouse for them, and it's something that's quite natural to them, and they might not be opposed to. It depends. Usually, families do want the best for their daughter, so they would try and get someone who will take care of their daughter, but sometimes that's not the case, which is very disappointing if a family finds someone who is not going to take care of their daughter. But usually families also try that. So those are arranged marriages where the family finds someone, and the young people also agree to get into such a marriage. But forced would be when they don't agree, or they have met the person or heard about that person and don't want to get into it.
Thank you. Now, some witnesses to this committee have discussed conditional permanent residence. And we know that if women present evidence that they are in a forced or abusive marriage, the proposed condition would cease to apply in those instances, and where there is evidence of abuse or neglect. Have you witnessed any cases of abuse or neglect?
Personally, I have. I had a friend who went through the situation, and she came in it was an arranged marriage, not a forced marriage, so she had never met her husband before, but she had agreed with her family to get into this marriage and come to Canada. But when she came here, she went through all kinds of abuse, physical, emotional, economic, and she is a good case study because she finally went to the services and they took her away from her husband, her and her child, and she was able to get a lot of training and skill development. First, she got training as an English language service provider within the same community center that supported her, and eventually she did her law, and now she's a lawyer, working on domestic violence cases. So I've seen one case that ended up really well.
Well, that's fortunate for her. But what kind of evidence did she present?
It's an interesting case because she herself had internalized the violence and she was not reporting it. But she was talking to her doctor on the phone when her husband started abusing her, and the doctor heard her and sent the social services, social workers, and then they said, we believe that there's abuse going on and we would like to separate you from this family. So they took her away to a shelter, and after a lot of psychological help, she was able to really say that yes, she had been abused. And that's how, they had the proof because they were able to go right then when the doctor reported that I heard abuse going on. They were able to see the violence, but at the moment she said, no, I fell down the stairs.
Okay. Was she afraid to also report it potentially because she was afraid of losing her PR status? Do you think that's one of the reasons?
She had no idea of the rights that she had or the status. She didn't have her passport. It was with her in-laws, so she had no idea what would happen, and they were always threatening her.
How much time do I have?
He has 7 minutes. You have a couple of minutes
left.
Oh,
okay, yeah.
Minute and
you
a
said
half,
I still had 7 minutes. I thought, wow.
Oh, no, you have a couple of minutes left.
That went really fast. And I will ask... okay. Ms. Duplessis, your organization tries to reach out to women in isolation. This can obviously present some challenges since clearly the man would like to keep away from any contact or support. Have you heard of any cases where the man might find the woman out who was seeking support and the situation got worse? So for example, if there's a spouse... Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oui, merci.
Thank you, Mr. Opitz. I can't get into something that I'm not familiar with. Our organization is not an organization that works with women who have suffered abuse. So perhaps you should ask that question of the other two witnesses who would be able to answer it better with more information. But thank you for your question.
I wanted to point out that language requirements are actually introduced by the Liberals in the original Act. So I think with that, my time is up.
Ms. Moline, I have a question for you, and it's a question I asked the bureaucrats when they were here. And we could have a situation, well, it's not a hypothetical situation, but it's a situation where the man says there was fraud involved. The wife left, and it was fraudulent. The wife says, no, it was physical and mental abuse. So, there's three different areas. There could be the criminal aspect. If there's physical abuse, that's assault, and that's evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. And then we have a matrimonial court. I have no idea what goes on in the civil code, but presumably it's similar to Ontario, which would be on the balance of probabilities as to who's telling the truth. And then we have immigration, which my understanding it may not even be a judicial decision. It might be an administrative decision as to who's telling the truth.
Quasi-judicial,
yes. Do you see a problem there? Well, I mean, I just look at strange conflicts of law. You could even have conceivably different decisions. Someone could say the husband's telling the truth. Someone could say the wife's telling the truth.
Yeah, I haven't witnessed a case where you had those three scenarios. What I've witnessed is women under severe stress, traumatic situations where women are put under the microscope and people don't believe, and that they have to prove that they've been victims of violence, and that's pretty dramatic. On top of suffering that they have to go through all that stress, I think that we should take measures, the government should take measures in place to just treat women with more kindness.
Okay.
Yes.
Ms. Blanchette-Lamothe, you have a question. Very brief question.
Very brief
Thank
question.
you for letting me take your time.
No problem. For Madame Hassan.
For Madame Hassan, just to come back to something Ms. Duplessis said, perhaps the government should automatically enroll or register those women who arrive in Canada, register them in information sessions so that the most vulnerable of them will have a first contact with first-line services. Would you have an opinion on what the government could do? Yes, I quite agree, but I should add...
And service providers should be culturally sensitive, and it's better if you have someone who speaks their language or is from the same community, but that would be a great support to women coming in. Thank you.
Thank you. And our time is expired. And I thank the three of you for coming to the committee and giving us your views on many different issues. So thank you very much. This committee is adjourned.